Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. We've heard a great deal recently about the deaths of African Americans at the hands of the police, about the overrepresentation of blacks in our nation's prison population, about the economic challenges facing low-income individuals and families, which are disproportionately black, and about the difficulties African American youngsters face in school and other aspects of their day-to-day lives. Why do black Americans face so many very serious challenges? Is racism the primary cause? Lack of employment or education opportunities? Family breakdown? We'll discuss this with my guest, Vilna Bashi Treitler, who is a professor of sociology and Black and Hispanic studies here at the CUNY Graduate Center and at Baruch College, and with Robert Cherry, a professor of economics at the Graduate Center and at Brooklyn College. Welcome. Thanks very much for coming by. I appreciate it. One of the more astonishing things that I've read recently came out of a White House study, which was part of President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative. And it said that a black male born 25 years ago has only a 1 in 2 chance of being employed because of the combined impact of early deaths, incarceration, low labor force participation, and high unemployment. 1 in 2 chance. That's someone who's 25 years old. When you hear something like that, what are the first thoughts that come into your mind?
Those numbers are just very depressing, and when you even go under and you look at those who have more limited education, less than a high school or just a GED, the employment rates for 25 to 29-year-olds are under 30%. And there's more 25 to 29-year-olds with those low levels of education in prison than in paid employment. And they represent about 25% of young black men in that age group. So it's somewhat even worse.
Right. Than
for
the
that
initial
group.
numbers would
Yes.
say. Professor Bashi Treitler, what occurs to you when you hear that?
Well, it makes me think of the state of our nation as a whole. I mean, we have a segment of the population that's inordinately suffering. I think if young people don't ever get the first job, you can't build a career. You don't get the second or third. You don't have a chance to build a family the way it's still expected to do so in our country, to have some economic independence and find a partner and so on. So it seems to me to portend a really bleak future.
When we look at these disastrous unemployment numbers, what are some of the reasons why the joblessness is so high?
Well, I think it's very important to remember that the unemployment rate is calculated by measuring the number of people who are actually looking for jobs, not people who just don't have one.
Right.
So it's indicative of people really wanting to participate in the labor force, really wanting to work and not being able to find a job. And there are even greater numbers of people if you add in those who are just have given up on trying to find work.
Well, that's a good point. The official jobless statistics are only talking about people who are actively looking for work, which means that the overall picture is actually worse than
that's why
jobless numbers.
I think that's why Michael Smith and I quote employment statistics, because that gets around this whole question. It says, look, whatever the reason, how many people have paid employment?
Right.
And that's where you get overall maybe 50. When you take the less educated, it's more like 25, 30% have jobs. And I think that you asked, what are the reasons? And for me, I think it's a feedback mechanism where you have this joblessness, it plays havoc on family formation, so that you have, particularly in the black community, not simply children born out of wedlock, but you have multi-partner fertility where you have women giving birth sequentially to different men, and the kind of havoc that creates within the family where it's very disruptive for kids, and you have absent fathers, you have the father in the house who is not the biological parent can often bring his frustrations and anger from what goes on in society for him, bring it into the house, so you get child maltreatment. So this employment issue has to be solved because it has these kind of feedback mechanisms that make it more difficult for the next generation.
And explain how you see employment linked to those issues that you're talking about.
If so many men are idle, not necessarily because of their own fault. The employment market isn't exactly a meritorious environment for black men. So they have a lot of good reason to be angry at the situation they're in. But unfortunately, it doesn't allow them to have stable relationships. And that frustration has negative consequences in the house, which then filter back to what you see for very young children, educational deficits, behavioral problems. And so you just have this cycle, and I think it's not simply racial. You see the same thing in white communities, not to the same extent because you don't have the discrimination in the labor market, but you have this marginalization of working class men that's creating havoc throughout the working class society, but you see it more pronounced in the black community.
Professor Bashi Treitler, do you see the same linkage between joblessness, unemployment, and the problems that Professor Cherry is talking about?
I do see some linkages, but I think that the impetus really needs to be put on the labor market. The reason for this is I agree that the problems exist also in white communities. I think that this is one of the reasons things like the GI Bill got started. A lot of white men come back from overseas and weren't finding work and weren't being reintegrated into the economy in ways that they expected, and that would have caused a great deal of social unrest, and solutions had to be found. I think racism does play a large part, again, in the fact that these are people looking for work and not being able to become employed. They want employment and aren't able to find it. I'm not really comfortable with pathologizing the black community in this way. I think that joblessness hurts all communities, but because of racial discrimination in our society, these deficits get heaped on a particular community.
To what extent do you think racial discrimination still plays a role in black unemployment?
Oh, I think it's huge. I'm glad that we agree we're not in a meritorious society. I think there have been many studies on black men seeking work. There's a study, I hope I get this right, by Bruce Western and David Pager about men looking for work. They took equal men. They were the same age. They looked the same. They had the same resumes. And when black men went looking for work, they were asked about histories of incarceration that were not on their resumes because the men didn't have them. Right. And they were presumed to have been hiding information about
employers
this.
Asked whether they'd been in prison,
exactly,
for example.
Exactly. Right. And white men who said they had been incarcerated, were convicted of crimes, were hired at greater rates than the black men.
Professor Cherry, can you talk about what you've seen in terms of the extent of racial discrimination in employment for African Americans?
I think there is certainly a certain amount, but the fact was that in that study in Milwaukee, men from neither group got all that many jobs. Yes, it was much more for black men that didn't. And I think that's true in general in the labor market, that people with weak skills have trouble getting, but black men have even more trouble getting. And, the fact is that when you look at reading scores coming out of high school and a variety of measures of hard skills and soft skills, there's just too many black men who are coming out with such weak skills that you can understand why they don't get employment. Now, more of them still should, but race then comes to play and it kind of reinforces stereotypes. But I think that the problem is black young people increasingly don't have direct access to employment when they're teenagers. And this is something that's different from 20, 30 years ago, where, when we grew up, it was typical for working class kids to have jobs as teenagers. Now, teen employment for black youth is maybe 10 or 15%. So they don't have the kind of work experience that give them a kind of resume that will offset some of the other disadvantages and the discrimination that they face. So I think one of the real problems is the lack of direct employment or pathways to employment when they are young, when they're 18, 17, 19, 20. And that's what my real emphasis has been in trying to get programs. And I think Mayor de Blasio's Young Men's Initiative, which he recently undertook, is looking at that issue of getting experiences young.
But if that's the case, why are these pathways blocked when these young men especially are seeking employment?
They could be blocked by a number of things. One is that we don't have that strong an economy. But
that would affect whites as well as blacks in that age group.
The white teen employment rate has also been halved in the last 15 years. Now it's been halved so it's 25% instead of 50%, where the black rate is 10 or 15% instead of 30%. But this has become a general problem, and it ends up that a lot of that low-wage labor market is networking, and for a variety of reasons, white kids, just as Latinos, have much better networking relationships in the low-wage labor market than black youth have.
I think that, networking certainly plays a very important role in our economy in lots of ways: housing, labor markets, relationship markets, everything. And that, I think, would make us want to take a really hard gaze at segregation. You can't network with people that you have...
You mean housing segregation?
Housing segregation, right. And labor market segregation. Our economy is segregated in many ways. Where blacks may be working in white-collar industries, they're in the mailroom. They're not talking with anyone, basically, except to possibly say good morning. Those are not the connections that are going to get you jobs. There's also studies that young black youth are kind of demonized once they hit adolescence. So that young person who was a good scholar, a great student, a good friend, becomes someone to fear when he gains a certain height and a certain build. It's the same person, just racism and discrimination and segregation and the lack of communication with black communities, I think, really segments people from being able to access networks and labor markets where they could have otherwise.
One of the things that has always struck me and maybe has not been particularly well understood is that over the years, the government has been a pathway to employment for African Americans that's been particularly important. And that's been primarily because of discrimination, racial discrimination. Decades ago, I think we can all agree, it was much more difficult for blacks to get hired in the private sector. I think it's still difficult in many cases. But government employment has been under pressure in recent years both for economic reasons, budgetary reasons on the one hand, and for political reasons. I mean, the movement toward smaller government and that sort of thing. To what extent do you see that as another contributing factor to this employment problem we're talking about?
I certainly think for black professionals, it will be a serious problem. In the 1980s, 2/3 of black professionals worked for government.
Isn't that peculiar?
Yes, because as you said, there was discrimination in the private sector, and what I think I'm much more focused on is what happens in the non-four-year college labor markets. And certainly the government has jobs. I mean, secretarial staff has been reduced. So there's much less, we see at the university, much less non-professional labor. And so I think it's somewhat more of an issue for, I think, black professionals than it is for black workers, but
I think the point I was trying to get at is if this pathway, for example, to black professional jobs or middle-class jobs, even if they aren't particularly professional jobs, if those pathways are blocked, if it becomes more difficult to get that government employment, you start seeing more low-wage families, more low-wage individuals and families, people who never make it into the middle class.
In fact, I think there's a lot of downward pressure. I mean, we have in this country many and underemployed PhDs who then take lower level jobs, and then the credentialing requirements are raised, and then those people who would have had those jobs are taking lower level jobs. So everyone in the economy suffers, and then at the bottom segment, you'll tend to find those in the black community.
If you could just wave a magic wand and begin to take some steps to counteract these kinds of problems, what are a couple of the things that you'd like to see happen?
If I had a magic wand, I would eliminate racism. Absolutely.
I'd wave that wand with you.
I don't know how that could be done. I really, this is what my scholarship is about, and I'm absolutely flummoxed as to how we are here after having a civil rights movement that I thought was somewhat of a beacon to the world, and now we are in every news cycle hearing about someone else, some other innocent person being killed.
If you were going to give us a grade as a society, let's say from the heyday of the civil rights movement back in the 1960s until now, obviously a great deal of progress has been made, but maybe not as much as a lot of people think. So if you were going to grade the level of progress since that time, what kind of a grade would you give it? I get to ask these questions of academics.
Okay. Well, this is hard because I would say, given the potential of the civil rights movement, I would say, wow, this is a country that could do really, really well. And having seen what I would consider not exactly, I don't think backsliding is exactly the right word. I think there's sort of a tension between maybe some forces that really understand that we could do better and forces that seem to be very stubborn and resistant to racial progress. And so I would have to say maybe a C+.
Maybe a
C. Not failing, but certainly you could do a lot better.
I'm going to ask you for a grade in another area, since you're an economist. You mentioned that there are employment difficulties across the board in this country. The fact is we don't create enough jobs for everybody who,
for working class
who
men.
wants and needs to work. So in terms of where we are in the overall economy, how well are we doing in terms of providing employment?
Well, I think that part of the issue, I mean, where I feel uncomfortable is there's this overwhelming victimization narrative that people are victims of the system, particularly blacks are victims of racism. And I think this victimization narrative is overstated. I think one of the problems is the school system. The school systems are producing just very weak, particularly among men. Women are doing much better, young women. Men, they have lower high school graduation rates. 2/3 of four-year college graduates are women. There's this problem of men and what happens in the school system, and it's particularly severe for young black men in the school system. And unless that's solved, and I don't think it's necessarily victimization. I think part of it is this dynamics of the family that creates problems, but that's where the issue is. What is going on in the school system that produces too many boys that have neither the hard skills nor soft skills that employers are going to look favorably on.
But to go to your point about the percentage of people who are of working age who are actually employed, they're at historic lows across the board in this country. So if we had another million college graduates of whatever color next year, do you think that million college graduates would all be able to get jobs?
But it's not college graduates. I mean, that's the whole problem.
But going to your point about people are not prepared for these jobs, that they're not educated enough or they don't have the proper skills and that sort of thing. If they did, behavioral traits. If they had all of that, my contention is that there wouldn't be enough jobs for them in any event. They'd be better off, but there would not be enough jobs in this economy. I think, but I'll pose it as a question. Do you
Well,
think
I would
there
say it
be?
another way is if one waved a magic wand and generated few million more good jobs, I think that a very large share of the people who are graduating high school would not be able to take those jobs. That's what's happening in manufacturing to a substantial
So if they
degree.
were available, they would not be able to get those jobs.
If they were good jobs. Now, if they're fast foods and service jobs, maybe they could start out there, but
Professor, yes, you're going to get the last word, and you may interject.
Okay, thank you. Well, if my second wave of my magic wand would make this a real meritocracy, and I think we certainly could talk about incentives. If a young man knows that no one in his community has gotten a job, that no amount of schooling made most of the people he is aware of successful, I don't think there's a whole lot of incentive to do anything differently. But had we been in a meritocracy where there was some kind of equal opportunity and where working hard actually got you that reward, I think things would certainly change a great deal.
So you think there would be a cultural shift?
A cultural shift, a structural shift, an economic shift, absolutely.
I wish we had more time to talk about this. Both of you have been terrific. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. We'll be back in a moment with a final word. The railroad tunnels that connect New York and New Jersey beneath the Hudson River are all fouled up. They're old, they're decrepit, and they're a nightmare for commuters. If you're one of those commuters, you'll get up in the morning with no idea of whether you'll get to work on time. The U.S. Transportation Secretary, Anthony Fox, has said the failure to upgrade this heavily traveled network of tunnels is almost criminal. But think about it. Isn't this always the way we behave when it comes to infrastructure in the United States? We neglect it, ignore it, until some kind of disaster happens. We've got potholes all over the metropolitan area. We lose electrical power every time the weather turns bad, if it gets too hot, or it rains too hard, or the winds start to really blow. We've got bridges in a state of virtual collapse. But we don't want to spend a penny in extra taxes to keep our physical plant in tip-top shape. Governor Cuomo has announced a plan to rebuild LaGuardia Airport, and it's about time. But we've still got to contend with clogged highways and backed-up tunnels and bridges. And we're often left grumbling on overcrowded train and subway platforms, all because of our willful refusal to keep our infrastructure in good repair. What's that old saying? You get what you pay for. That's all for now. See you next time.